Hello, I'm Maria Balinska, and I'm the Executive Director of the US-UK Fulbright Commission, and I want to warmly welcome everyone, our speakers and our audience, to this Fulbright Connects event. When we invited Janet Napolitano to be our Fulbright Legacy Lecturer, we were very much looking forward to welcoming her in person to the UK this spring. The annual lecture series that takes us to the campuses of the University of Edinburgh, King's College London, and Oxford is a highlight of our year. COVID-19, of course, brought all those plans to a halt. But the crisis that COVID-19 has caused and the dramatic moment of racial reckoning that we're going through now have only made the focus of President Napolitano's lectures, higher education and the public good, even more urgent and relevant to people on both sides of the Atlantic and indeed around the world. The pandemic is a global problem. Racial injustice is a global problem. This is why our Fulbright mission of building bridges of understanding between countries and of advancing knowledge and empowering connections for the common good is so very important right now. And this is why we're also so grateful and excited to be able to bring together 4 of the world's eminent academic leaders to discuss these issues virtually between Oakland, California, Edinburgh, London, and Oxford. I want to thank our university partners for all their work in helping us put this event together, and also our sponsors, the Lois Roth Endowment and the Fulbright Association, for their support. And now over to our moderator, Mukul Devichand. Mukul has been both reporter and producer at the BBC. He's currently the corporation's executive editor of artificial intelligence and voice. And last, but certainly not least, he's a Fulbright alumnus and graduate of the Columbia Journalism School. Mukul.
Hi, thanks, Maria. So welcome, everybody. Today's event is about higher education and the public good. And I think that phrase, public good, and what our university leaders take those words to really mean at this uniquely challenging time is what this is all about. And may I say, what a cast of university leaders we have to consider this question. So here's a brief overview of how things are going to work and how you can participate. You should note that we will be recording this event and we'll be posting it on our YouTube channel. So I will begin with a short interview with our Fulbright honoree, President Janet Napolitano, to take her view of this question of higher education and public good. And then I'll be opening up to a discussion between President Napolitano and our 3 very distinguished British university leaders. And then we'll have the last 20 minutes or so for your questions. But you can start submitting your questions at any time. And in fact, we would really love it if you would, because it will help us. So please do so using the comment box at the bottom of the screens. So first, I am delighted to introduce Janet Napolitano, a lawyer by training, and I have to say this bit because we have this in common. She spent some of her undergraduate study time at the London School of Economics, and then she went on to become the governor of Arizona, and then a very significant role as the Secretary of Homeland Security under President Barack Obama, where she was noted for her thoughtful approach to the enormous challenges of movement across the US border. And for the past 7 years, she has been president of the largest public research university in the United States, the University of California. And I just want to give you guys who don't know some idea of the scale of that task. UC has 250,000 employees, more than 250,000 students, 10 campuses, 5 medical centers, 3 affiliated national laboratories, and a statewide agriculture and natural resources program. So thank you for coming, President Napolitano, and welcome.
Well, thank you. It's a delight to be here, if only by video Zoom, which I think we've all been living on for the past months.
We have. It's a funny way to do things, but we are very grateful that we can still do them. So let's start with that question of the public good and bring it to questions of equality and social justice. So, obviously the Black Lives Matter movement started in California. One of its founders holds a UC degree. What do you think a powerful system like UC can do as we debate how to address questions of systemic racism? And do you see a greater role for the university as we now grapple with these deeper questions raised by the killing of George Floyd?
I think there's a very important role for universities, particularly public universities like the University of California. I think that our key role is to educate, and I think we need to really examine, are we educating our students as to the foundations for structural racism in the United States, giving them the historic and cultural context? Are we educating them in how to deal with questions involving structural racism? Are we preparing them to make the changes necessary to root out structural racism? So that's one aspect. And the second aspect is what can our scholars do, those who are expert in the study of cultures, of race, sociology, anthropology, psychology, all the ologies actually, to help our society grapple with structural racism and to develop ideas that can be fed into the public policy machinery for changes in the law, changes in practices. Take, for example, policing. We know in the United States we have an issue with policing. We need to understand better what policing is, what it is not, how better to recruit and train police officers. And that all can be better informed by scholars at the university.
It's fascinating. Can I, on that question of structural change and legal change, one of the questions that UC faces is around affirmative action and admissions. So far, according to the law in California, you haven't been able to consider the idea of race overtly in admissions. Will that change? Should that change? And if it did change, would that open up the door to another role or further action by UC?
The voters of California barred the use of race or gender in college admissions 20 some odd years ago. The question of repealing that bar will be on our November ballot, and the regents of the University of California are supporting that repeal. I support that repeal. Why? In our admissions process, we look at 14 factors about the student. We want to look at the whole student. The one thing we can't look at is something that's essential to the student, and that's their race, their ethnicity, and their gender. It's such an artificial limitation. So I'm hopeful that the voters of California will support the repeal of, it's called Proposition 209, support that repeal so that we can consider race, ethnicity, and gender in admissions. And we have to consider it properly. It has to be not the sole factor, not the dominant factor. It needs to be included as one of many factors as we evaluate the whole student.
Thanks. I just want to quickly mention here that I think I got the phraseology wrong about how you can submit your questions. Use the Q&A box at the bottom. Please keep them coming in. President Napolitano, can I just ask you then, there's obviously this role around education and considering some of these deep questions. And then there's potentially numbers and bringing in a more diverse population into universities. But despite universities making strides in these directions, there is a kind of a question around public confidence in universities and what they do to solve these problems and others. So if I just highlight a couple of statistics, last month, a survey by the New American Foundation think tank highlighted that African Americans and Latinos are more skeptical than whites of the value of a university education for them. And perhaps at the other end of the political spectrum, in 2019, a Pew survey indicated that the perception of value that universities bring to wider society is declining markedly in the United States, and particularly by Republican voters. So, you know, that's two kind of declines in confidence of the university. Are you worried that actually you're not getting something right in universities around this question of public good and addressing it and communicating that to people?
Oh, I think we all should be concerned about that. I think if those polls had been taken in the 1950s, they would have had a very different result. I think we've seen that skepticism about all public institutions in the United States, and higher education is not immune, but that skepticism grow. You know, let me put on my former hat as an elected politician who had to run for office. And it seems to me that what we're not doing is kind of a concentrated, focused campaign. You know, why universities? Why college education? Why it matters to you? I suspect that virtually all the viewers on this webinar already believe in universities. We're preaching to the choir. But we need to change our focus and our audience. Who do we need to speak with? And who needs to hear from us directly? Who needs to see the examples of students who have come to our universities, graduated, and are leading very successful lives? So I actually think it's not so much what universities do, but how universities communicate and with whom.
So briefly on that question then, you know, the old adage goes, never waste a good crisis. And we certainly are globally in a crisis right now with COVID-19. And, you know, that is going to have a huge impact on universities, on everything from budgets to, you know, the pressure for solutions to the pandemic. Is this a moment for universities to change how they behave, to do something differently in this question of confidence in them?
You know, I think under the adage, never let a good crisis go to waste, this is a moment for universities to evaluate and be very introspective on what we do. You know, what is the difference? What is the value of having 4 years residentially at a college or university versus staying home in your bedroom and taking classes by Zoom? Well, there's a real difference there. There is the social experience of being a student. It's the opportunity to make friends across race, across gender, across ethnicity, nationality, and so forth. It's the ability to have spontaneous exchange with professors and to continue conversations that begin in the classroom, say to the dining hall. It's the opportunity to participate in extracurricular activities, in athletics and clubs and the like. And this is all part of the maturation process of students as they mature from 17 and 18-year-olds to 21, 22-year-olds. And it's the preparation of those students, both for the job market and more importantly, for a research university, for graduate school. So we need to examine how we have that value add when we're still not able to reopen our campuses fully. So what does that mean? You know, one of our campuses is creating student cohorts on Zoom and hoping by that mechanism, by that tactic to help replicate the kinds of social networking friends that you have when you're physically on a campus. Other of our campuses are looking at how you can actually instruct someone for performance in a wet lab, and when you're not actually in the laboratory. Wow. So, you know, there's a lot of innovation that needs to go on here. Our goal, obviously, is once it's safe and there's a a good therapeutic or vaccine is to be able to return students and faculty safely to the campuses. But I think that's months, if not years away.
And obviously some of those challenges are felt by universities in the UK just as much. Also, that confidence kind of challenge, I think, is transatlantic. So ahead of this, King's College London conducted a poll alongside IPSOS Mori, and they found that 77% globally have confidence in research universities and that think that they have a key role to play in addressing global challenges. Similar numbers in the US and the UK. So research, yes, people have confidence, especially in very practical areas such as health. But at the same time, there's the same story on both sides of the Atlantic of that decline in confidence in universities. So under 40% in both the UK and the US are positive about the impact of the university on them personally. It's not too high a number. And 50% in both countries, which is again not high enough really, are positive that universities have an impact on their community where they live. So with that contradiction in mind, I want to bring in our distinguished UK panel now to consider this as a kind of as a transatlantic question. And I'm going to start by asking each of you to respond to these results. And do you feel academia has a problem here? Have people lost confidence in universities, and why? And I'd like to start with Ed Byrne. He's a neuroscientist by training, and he's Principal and Vice Chancellor of King's College London.
Look, it's a crucial question, and one I think about a great deal. To cut to the chase, I think the answer to the question is yes. Charles Clarke and I wrote a book on this recently and developed the theme at some length. It strikes me as a bit odd on the surface because universities are more powerful than they've ever been. They're doing more research, they're producing more great things, we're graduating more brilliant young people. So why is it that we seem to have lost a little relevance with the general public and with politicians? And I think there are two reasons. I think one, in most Western countries, half of the population never go anywhere near a university. Their children don't, their grandchildren don't. It's all a bit remote. And we've sort of accepted that, I think, a little bit too much. This is the disenfranchised group. We haven't done nearly enough to improve things there across the board. The second thing might sound a little bit more highfalutin, but I've thought for a long time that many of the most brilliant people in the world work in universities. You can't dispute that. And almost every brilliant person goes through one university or another at some stage. So we have a huge capacity. Yet the world has huge problems. It's less connected internationally. Leadership in a global sense is poorer than it was. Wherever you look, and I'm not talking about everybody, probably few people listening to this lecture fall into this category, but committed citizenship is less generous than it used to be. Respect for science is less uniform. There many people, of course, haven't changed any of this, but society, we've lost something. So there's so many things that we need to do better. We probably said to ourselves, look, we're doing a good job, we're doing our research, we're educating people, yet the world's going to hell around us. It's not our fault, it's somebody else's. I don't think we can say that anymore. We've become a little bit too self-centered, too mired in our own success rather than society and the planet's success, too inward-looking. In some institutions, perhaps at times a little bit too mired in the past. These are dangerous generalizations because, of course, many of our community aren't like that at all. And most of our community want to make a much greater contribution. But I think it's much more important now to be overtly a civic institution, to be more overtly aligned with society's needs than perhaps it was once. Any vestige of the ivory tower needs to go. As Charles and I said in our book, not only do we need to do many things differently, but we need to do some different things and be a little bit more humble about the whole deal.
Yeah, and Professor Bird, I'll come back to some of those questions in a bit. But can I turn now for your reflections on this question to Peter Mattison, nephrologist and principal and vice chancellor of the University of Edinburgh. What is your view? Do you think people have lost confidence in universities? And if so, why?
Thank you very much, Mukul. I mean, the survey, like many surveys, contains some mixed messages and some glass half full interpretations and some glass half empty interpretations. I think the underlying question, and the one that Ed has already addressed, is, has there been a loss of confidence in universities worldwide? I think the answer is yes, there has, and I think it's been true in the UK. And I think quite a lot of it is the university's fault. I don't think we should blame other parties. I think we should acknowledge our own failings in terms of talking to, as Ed talks about, what we like to talk about is the other 50%, the half of society that doesn't engage directly with us or benefit directly from us, and we're not very good at talking to that other 50%, and I think we need to get much better at it. In Edinburgh's case, we have the world's largest cultural festival here every summer. Sadly, it's been cancelled this year because of coronavirus, but it's happened every other year since 1947, I think it is. One of the problems that the festival tackles is that it feels that quite a lot of Edinburgh citizens don't believe that the festival is for them. They believe it's for somebody else. It's for visitors, or it's for posh people, or it's for other people other than themselves. And the festival works very hard to engage that part of the Edinburgh population, and indeed the regional population. And in some of my conversations with the festival since I got here, I've only been here 2.5 years, but since I got here, I've been really struck by the parallels between the festival's attempt to engage with parts of Edinburgh that don't feel it's for them. They could be talking about the University of Edinburgh. There's whole parts of Edinburgh that don't feel the University of Edinburgh is for them. And we've really got to do something about that. So we're working on engaging with schools and communities and other parts of the society that don't necessarily immediately see the relevance of having a highly regarded international university right on their doorstep. And I think we've got to acknowledge our responsibility for that. The one other comment I'd make is just around university funding. We, like most universities, and the vast majority of universities in the UK are publicly funded universities. But what that actually means has changed quite substantially in the last few years. At one time, universities were funded substantially by large grants towards their educational costs, and the introduction of tuition fees and their gradual increase in terms of their level has been a feature of the higher education landscape in the UK for a large part of my career. And what I would say is that has led to all sorts of conversations about value for money and about expectations. There's a Scottish spin on that, in that in Scotland, students that are domiciled in Scotland, and currently students that are from the EU, don't have to pay upfront tuition fees because they're subsidised by the Scottish government. Students from the rest of the UK, England, Wales, Northern Ireland, do have to pay tuition fees at the capped level that's set in England, and international students pay higher tuition fees. So you can have 3 students doing the same course at the same university, paying anything from no tuition fees to something in excess of £20,000 a year. And my own view is that each of those students has the right to expect the same levels of service and standards, irrespective of who's paying for their education. But this whole dynamic around the funding of university education has undoubtedly been a factor in the UK in some of the dissatisfaction that you've uncovered in your survey.
Yeah, and we'll hopefully come back to that funding point as well. Yeah, I think, interesting that sort of town and gown challenge is not a new one, but certainly the survey, we're focusing on the US and the UK, but actually this was a globally felt thing, that, confidence in the university to solve community problems, and this question of value to the individual, that distinction was between that and loving the research that comes out of universities was global. I want to turn on this question finally to Irene Tracy. She's the Pro Vice Chancellor of the University of Oxford and the Warden of Merton College, Oxford. What's your view on this question of have people lost confidence in universities?
Yeah, no, thank you, Mukul. I mean, there's not much more to add from what Janet's already detailed, and Ed and Peter. Just to sort of maybe flesh out a little bit something Janet commented about, the sort of echo chamber problem, which again was picked up by Ed, that the work that hasn't been done most effectively, which arguably is easy, and I say this as a scientist for the sciences, and we've seen this with the COVID response, that it's arguably easier for science to make its relevance more obvious to the people outside of the university. And that argument, which some people feel that this is not going to benefit me, it's not going to necessarily enhance my opportunities in terms of jobs or careers, that for universities in certain other areas, we've not made that argument as compelling. So I think that sort of preaching to the converted, staying in the echo chamber, not recognizing that we have to work harder to get out there, to take our message out to communities and to communities outside of our conventional communities, is not going to be done for us. I'm surprised at no point anybody's mentioned the role of the media in this. And it's not always the case that the scientists get an easy ride. I mean, we've gone through a period in Britain recently with a lot of expert bashing, particularly around science. If we look at the sort of distrust in science around global warming, our economists were sort of under fire, you know, in all the sort of negotiations around Brexit. So there's many examples of where, again, people curry favor and you're sort of in and out. And the power of the media to control the messaging is something I think we need to be mindful of, but I think we also owe it to ourselves to get out there, and it starts with your local community. If I sort of think about Oxford, I'm a local girl, so I'm born and bred here, so I've seen it as town and gown. And it's an extraordinary different relationship over these recent years than it was when I was growing up, where there really was a greater separation. So the relevance of this huge international, what should be considered proud thing for the local community just wasn't there, because we weren't closely in conversation and making that relevance for the local person in the street. So, you know, we employ 33,500 people, you know, we contribute 7 billion to the economy globally, etc. I think that work that needs to be done to get the message out about why and how it is that this opportunity with this particular degree really can make a difference to you. And here are some role models, here are some ambassadors that can, you know, be like you, that you can recognize that journey, is something which I think we've slowly woken up to the fact we're going to have to take more charge of that and actually be on the front foot going forward in that messaging. And it would be great if we could engage with other forums to do that. And I'd be interested to know what the other, the vice chancellors, you know, on this call think about that. And again, that sort of love-hate relationship sometimes we have with social media and conventional media.
Well, look, I mean, you've touched on something of great interest to me personally. You know, as I edit AI for the BBC. So yes, I mean, certainly there's a communication challenge, right? Which is possibly about the role the media play, possibly, as you say, about the structural change in communication generally in the media and social media and so on. But actually, there's also something about what you are doing as universities and how you do it. And I'm quite, if I can bring up this question of, you know, this, you know, we're speaking here as part of the US-UK Fulbright Commission, and you know, we're about international collaboration at the same time. And you know, COVID-19 is clearly something that needs to be about international collaboration. At the same time, a lot of the political rhetoric has been at the national level, and universities, if they are committed to a global mindset, you know, need to continue that global aspect, meanwhile responding to some of these accusations leveled at them that they are part of this remote global elite, or they're more interested in going, you know, sort of Michael Gove and Donald Trump have kind of alluded at this, you know, more interested in being part of that circuit perhaps than being part of their community. So, you know, how are you going to square that global role and that local one? And I can take that, if I can take that back to you, Professor Tracy.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, if you take the COVID one, you know, obviously there's the immediate local delivery of the clinical need that needs to be met. And that's done at a national level, rightly so, and then broken down regionally. And as you say, you know, academic institutions have always been global. I mean, for centuries and centuries, we've worked in a very, right from back in the day, you know, writing letters to each other, exchanging ideas. I mean, the basis of academic learning and discovery, particularly the discovery piece, has always been a global enterprise. And you're quite right to point out that that can become considered quite a rarefied elitist thing. And we've got to, again, think about how we can change ourselves to make sure that both education, as Janet was saying, you know, the benefit of students actually being physically present, so they rub shoulders to people from different countries and different backgrounds, is a key part of the educated experience that they're going to have, and an essential sort of almost unquantifiable bit that's of great value, because they go out and take those global, broader perspectives into their jobs and into their workplace. And obviously you have people that are advising on national panels in terms of, again, giving a global perspective about what we're learning, and whether it's the pandemic in terms of how other countries are adapting to it or other aspects of that. So where we can, there are those channels to make sure that the necessity to think globally for these big challenges are there, but again, it seems that we're not often winning that argument all the time, and that's something, again, I think for us to think about and think about what would be more effective ways that we can make sure, because I think many of the big things facing us, as you say, rolling on this one is going to be the next agenda on the climate change. These are global problems that require global solutions, and that requires collaboration. So we're almost working at slight odds, and again.
Thank you. Can I offer you the chance to comment on that, President Napolitano? From the US perspective, how do universities, on the one hand, become part of this global community for research and for their students, while maintaining that close connection to community, especially when at the community level people seem to, be losing confidence in them?
Oh, it's such a difficult question, and I agree with what Irene said totally. But it's interesting. We are in a period now where so many countries of the world are retreating into nationalism, as opposed to appreciating that the huge problems confronting us are global in nature, from pandemic to climate change, one aspect of that nationalism is that, at least in the United States, our government is actually making the travel of students and researchers to our institutions more difficult. It's limiting visas. It's delaying interviews for visa applicants. It's investigating foreign researchers, particularly those from China, who are at our universities. So the whole dynamic is contra the appreciation of the fact that it is the community of nations that needs to come together. One thought is that this is an area where universities, particularly research universities, can lead by example and can show by virtue of the international sharing of knowledge and research and developments, particularly right now in the COVID period, helps advance the science for everyone, will ultimately help the world become safer. And it's going to be by a development identified by a researcher at Oxford or Edinburgh, and a researcher at Berkeley, and a researcher in maybe Wuhan. And again, we get to that point of communication. We need to not communicate those kinds of developments amongst ourselves, but we somehow need to get them out into the community for community appreciation. We need to use the tools of social media. We need to be in mainstream media. We need to get the information to where the information consumers we're trying to reach are. So there's just a lot to do in this area, but it's a great period for the never let a crisis go to waste theory to work.
And look, I know that Professor Byrne and Professor Matheson want to come in. I'm going to bring you both in, but if I can add in this slight complicating question of money into consideration of this mix, which Professor Matheson raised. Business models, and money is only going to get tighter. Fees are already high, obviously different between the US and the UK, but a factor in both countries. University of West of England has had to close its philosophy department. I don't know, at least that's been in the news. Without getting into the details of that case, there's also a lot of focus on how are we going to bring international students in, how are we going to bring out-of-state students in California. With all of those pressures on cost and those definitions of value, how can you hope, Professor Byrne, how can you hope to still deliver this public good message to community that is at the root of what we've been talking about today?
Well, that's what keeps me awake at night. I'm going to help do that because the times are more challenging, but they're also more demanding, and there's more need for us to do better. our basic mission is still the right mission. You know, it's great education, great research to make the world a better place. Our people are all international in their mindset. You know, they deal with an international commodity, knowledge. They do want to make the world a better place. And in every sustainable development goal area, the international benefits of people working together are immense. There's no nationalism in this, so there shouldn't be. I mean, why is it more difficult at the moment? You know, I see this as a transient phase. I think, you know, the needs of harnessing the intellectual potential around the planet, so much of which rests in the university sector, are so great. I don't think there'll be any long-term bars to universities collaborating to the full around these themes. I think we do have to get out with our message a little bit more, as you know, as a number of my colleagues have said. We need just to be a little bit more overt in not resiling from the position that the social sciences, the arts and humanities are incredibly important in every interdisciplinary SDG research theme. They're also incredibly important in educated citizenship. We need to stress that all but a handful of Nobel Prizes have been won in universities. You know, that universities have done their bit to make the modern world. And while, you know, the average citizen in many countries thinks of the era of the new have been led by Apple and Google and Microsoft and others. MIT and Harvard and Berkeley and King's and Edinburgh and Oxford are just as important. You know, we haven't got that message out strongly enough. But at the same time, we do need to be a little bit more integrated with the major growth cones than we have been. You know, is the social science, the philosophy, the morality around so many of the advances in the new information world being coped with adequately? Of course, the answer is no, it's not. And that's one area where we come in to the full. The divide between academia and the more advanced aspects of industry and sometimes government thinking have probably widened more than is optimal.
Yeah. Thanks. And can I bring you back in, Professor Peter Matheson, on this question? So, you know, there's a clear kind of task ahead, but as you were saying, you know, what about this different definition of value that comes from some of the business model pressures? You know, is this part of the problem that, are these things linked? Is the decline in confidence linked to the way that universities are approaching their business model?
If I may, Mukul, I'd like to just briefly answer the previous question as well, if I can. I mean, the previous question was about the desire to be locally relevant or internationally relevant. I don't think they're incompatible, and I think we all want both. And I think by applying the right principles and the right values, we can have both. But there may be slightly different requirements for us to be locally relevant as to those to be internationally relevant. So I just wanted to make that point. I think it's not that we see those things in competition. We see them as mutually supportive. And there's a sort of relation to that, to the second question. I mean, around the business model. I mean, the business model in the UK, where research, and in Scotland also teaching, I should say, or less so in England, but certainly in Scotland, teaching is also cross-subsidised. But research is very heavily cross-subsidised by other sources of income. And the two major sources of income are tuition fees from international students, who we can charge higher levels of fees because they're uncapped, those fees. And also what we call accommodation, catering and events. So other events, you know, we run the biggest hotel in Scotland during the festival, and we've lost that this year. So we've lost a substantial source of income. So some of our cross-subsidy is dependent on quite fragile sources. And if the UK really wants to maintain its research infrastructure effectively and be internationally competitive as a sector, then it's got to do something about that fundamental underlying problem. And that argument is constantly being made with government, and I think is actually being heard. So I think there's been some evidence of that recently, that could be a silver lining for us of the coronavirus pandemic, because it's exposed the fragility of the business model that we were previously dependent upon. The other way I wanted to answer your second question was by a couple of comments on inequality. because I know that's one of the other themes that you want to touch on. We are very global organizations. I'm fiercely protective of that. I think it's a really, as Irene said, very in a very articulate way, a very important aspect of the benefits of a university education. I'm very, very keen that we preserve that. I do think it's going to change. I think we need to travel less for reasons of climate and cost and everything else. And I think the experiment that we've been forced to do in recent times with digital collaboration has shown us that actually some of the things we thought might not be possible actually do work. And it's possible that that could be another silver lining. But I also wanted to make the point that we're not global organizations in an equal way. There's a lot of inequality. It's not even just the English-speaking world. I've got a particular affiliation with Uganda, but also other parts of the African continent, English-speaking nation. But our ability to interact with the African continent is not very well developed. And there's a whole series of reasons for believing that Western world universities, developed world universities, need to pay more attention to those parts of the world. The statistic I like is that of the next 3 billion people to be born on the planet, 2 billion of them will be in Africa. And so there is an extraordinary population explosion happening in Africa, and we need to be involved and working and helping and trying to understand the needs of those people. So I think there's a lot of inequality in both within individual universities, and the recent events have certainly made us all focus very intensely on our own organizations in that respect. But I think there's also some in terms of higher education globally. I don't think it's equally distributed, and I don't think our global activities are actually contributing to the ending of inequality as much as we would wish they do.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And so that's it for my bit, right? I'm not going to ask any more questions, but actually we're going to, and we're going to hear from what people are asking. A very, very long stream of questions in the chat, actually. A lot of what you said has sparked a lot of interesting stuff. Sticking with that question of inequality, I think that is actually the theme that a lot of people are focusing on, and on the cost of education and the cost that universities charge. And lots of comments on that. One very, very pointed one here, which I'm going to read out, and then ask you, President Napolitano, to respond to, and others in the panel. One questioner says, universities are now contributing to acute global inequality by saddling students with debt rather than redressing it, and are profoundly unequal and stratified places in themselves. It is not a question of communication, says this person, however comforting that idea may be. People are not, in fact, misguided, wrong, or quote unquote deplorable. Universities are businesses, and people are increasingly not able or minded to buy what they are selling. I don't know how you feel about that, President Napolitano. Quite a pointed way of putting it.
Oh, for sure. And I appreciate that question. But I'll just point out that at the University of California, any California student who comes from a family that makes less than $80,000 a year pays no tuition. And there's substantial financial aid for students from families up to about $160,000 a year income. So there is substantial subsidy so almost 60% of our undergraduates pay no tuition under that financial aid model. Now, to be sure, out-of-state students and international students, they pay more. Peter made this point. You can have students who are paying differently for the same instruction, but it's a public university paid for by the taxpayers of California, and therefore substantial financial aid there. The point I want to make, however, is that I've given 100 speeches or hundreds of speeches, it seems like, and every time I point out that it is free to attend for anyone from a family that makes less than $80,000 a year. People, they gasp. It's like they had no knowledge or appreciation of that. And so again, there's a gap. There's a gap from what we do, how we do it, and how the public understands what we do and how we do it.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I'm going to move on to a slightly different topic from the money stuff for a second. So this is an interesting debate that a lot of people have raised, which is when we talk about issues of social justice, and this questioner says, if universities have to take on the issues of social justice, which I strongly believe they should, does that mean that the question of academic freedom is outdated? And this tension is an interesting one, isn't it? Because it keeps coming up. I don't know if I can go to some of our British VCs on that. Professor Byrne, perhaps, if you're interested in commenting on that.
Well, the notion of academic freedom certainly isn't outmoded. And by that, I mean the ability to comment widely and freely in your area of discipline and things you know about. I don't think it's freedom to comment about anything in any area beyond the freedom that any citizen has. Look, I think I'd probably prefer to some of my others colleagues to comment. I mean, at both universities I've been the president of, we've worked very hard on diversity and equity and building a tolerant community. And I guess we've contributed in three ways around these themes. That one is to have people doing great research around, incredibly important areas for a cohesive society, and I could give hundreds of examples of that. The second is to second people who are expert in these things into national structures where they have an impact. And the third is to build a society within the university itself which exemplifies a fair, diverse, tolerant and caring community. Now, of course, the latter is a journey. But it's a journey, that most universities that I know of are on, and certainly the ones that I've worked in are all on that journey, somewhere on that journey. But I think ahead of many other parts of society in that regard.
Okay, very interesting. I don't know if anybody else has something to add on this. Does standing for these values actually threaten academic freedom?
I'm very happy to come in, Mukul, if I may. I mean, I agree with what I said. I mean, I think the concept of academic freedom is sacrosanct, and I think is very important to universities and to members of universities. The freedom to disagree, I think, is an important aspect of that. I mean, universities are places of debate, but there are boundaries. So you've got to, if you're going to disagree, you've got to disagree within boundaries of decency and respect and the law. I think this was best articulated, in my opinion, by the University of Chicago a few years ago when it published a thing called the Stone Report. Stone being the provost at the time. And this was an articulation of what a university does and does not stand for, and what's permissible and what's not. It's a really excellent, rather short, but excellent articulation of these principles. And I think they say it very, very well.
Okay.
Yeah, just to add to that, just to, part of, to completely agree with everything, the academic freedom and that is so important, is that this is sort of bedrock really of what an academic institution stands for, and allows one to be liberated in your thinking, and that allows for the discovery and the creativity. But again, rightly, and it is challenging. I'm not going to, it's a great question, because we're all facing challenges in these precise areas, and part of the stewardship and the education that we're providing is to teach people, not just in these particular areas, but just more generally, is how to be respectful in how you criticize and how you have a dialogue and how you have a debate, and how do you give back that criticism, and how do you receive it, and I've seen interesting examples of how the ability to give and take. Again, this is a journey that we all are continually learning. It's not as if you sort of magically end up as an adult and have it perfect, but it's a vital part of what we're trying to also provide in an academic institution, training around, hopefully equipping people to go out into society and carry that with them.
Yeah, it's a very interesting set of questions, but I'm going to move it on to a different topic. Two big themes that we can sort of see in the questions coming in. One is around, which I'll come to in a second, around how universities can collaborate to solve some of these huge problems. But before we get to that, a couple of questions about, I think at the root of these is a lot of the conversation here has been about a fairly traditional model of education. But one person asks, what attitude do universities have to adult education and reinvention of lifelong learning? Another asks, what about new models of higher education, including digital/micro credentials? I'm not 100% sure what they are, but I suppose that's shorter qualifications, modular learning, stackable qualifications, all of that replacing this more traditional 3 or 4 year linear degree. Maybe, is that part of this question of widening out your community relevance? I don't know who wants to come in on that. President Napolitano, if you'd like to, Professor Tracy.
Yeah, I'll jump in because I do think this is a time where we need to be asking ourselves all of those questions, like why 4 years for an undergraduate degree? Why 3 years for a law degree in the United States? How is medical education structured? Is that done in the right way? And the issue of adult learning, I think, is a particularly important one. Why? Because the economy is changing. The skills and knowledge needed for new types of work will be changing. The average graduate of the University of California will have 10 or 12 different jobs over the course of a career. And so how is it that universities can expand their offerings and accessibility to provide an opportunity for adult learners to come back and learn? Now, our vision for that is to really expand what we can offer online because students can take that at their own schedule. So if they're working, they can take it at night, et cetera. And they can access it wherever they may live. But I do think as a public university, we need to broaden our vision beyond the 18 to 22-year-old to the entire range of a person's life.
Professor Tracy, I mean,
Yeah.
University of Oxford really moved to sort of micro-credentials?
Well, we'll be tested, in the Michaelmas term and the term coming up. We're going to move to this hybrid model. We obviously a hallmark of the teaching here is that small group tutorial teaching. So we're hoping to be able to preserve that in a socially distant way and then have a hybrid of online as well. So it's a very steep learning curve, I think, for us all in terms of how we're going to provide that. So that's sort of one thing, but just to support what Janet said, and it speaks a little bit to what Ed said about at the very start about how we have to change and do new things as well. I'm a big fan of lifelong learning and adult learning in particular. And I say that as a neuroscientist, it is good for brain health. People should just be learning new things and keeping skill up. And I just think there's such a untapped resource that we have sitting with retired personnel, working personnel, students, postdocs, many of whom are desperate to sort of engage and teach. This is something we could do on a large scale, and that would give us that touchstone with our local community. It would be good for the broader understanding of what on earth is going on behind these walls. It would do so much good, not least, in terms of the education that it would deliver. So I'm a big fan, and I think that is something that, again, this experiment we've all had very rapidly, hopefully that will let us reflect and think about, well, what could we be doing more in that regard? So I support what Janet was saying there.
Professor Byrne wants to come in, I think.
I was just going to say,
are you really going to be able to get there?
Yeah, we are. We'd already started. Our new School for Government is all around micro-credentials with the civil service. We have dozens and dozens of online master's degrees before the COVID crisis. And lifelong learning, somebody graduating at the age of 21 today from their undergraduate degree will probably live to 100 and have 7 different jobs or more, as Janet said. So they're going to come into education several times. It's changing so rapidly. But what the COVID crisis has done, rather like the Second World War did in technology generally, is it's accelerated this journey so massively. So we've moved so rapidly into online en masse in a way that would have been unthinkable just 6 months ago. And our world will never be the same. No, we won't abandon what was great before. Great teachers meeting in person, great students is going to be a bedrock, especially for undergraduates. But this massive infusion of technological capacity is going to leave our whole sector radically altered in terms of, we'll get to the same point we would have got to in any case, but it will just be so much more quicker.
Okay, a question that's come in on this is how do we incentivize and enable this sort of change? Overworked academics can't prioritize outreach work or engagement of this sort at the moment. Do you need more? Do you need more academics? I suspect this may have come from an overworked academic. I don't know who wants to comment on.
Can I start? Because that's a misconception. Yes, I mean, any change from one way of doing things to another way of doing things is stressful and difficult and take time. But when you embrace the two new technologies, it's not more work for anybody. It's a richer student experience, and it's less time commitment from academics because they're making the most of a rich array of technologies that enhance the experience both for them and for their students. But they have to try it, and they have to get used to it, and they have to convince themselves that that's the case. I mean, it is the case, I'm sure of that.
If I may, I know people want to talk about this one, but I'll just move it on to a final topic before the end, which is collaboration. And I think I'll ask you, President Napolitano, this question's come in. As someone who spearheaded the University Climate Change Coalition and other higher education climate action, what do you see as the future of this coalition? And I think, perhaps more interesting to us, more generally, the role of higher education institutions in working collaboratively to address climate change. How can universities collaborate globally? Because, the need for action is probably more acute than ever.
For sure. And climate change is the perfect example of where international collaboration amongst universities is going to be so important if we are to get control of this phenomenon. It's the real existential threat that confronts the planet right now. The University Climate Change Coalition, UC3, is a coalition of 20 some odd university and university systems in North America, mostly in the United States, but also including Canada and Mexico. And they are collaborating on climate change practices, development of new technologies, modalities, et cetera, that they can then translate and work with the local communities in which those universities are to adopt those practices and so forth. And I actually think that it's a movement that should spread around the world. The community of nations, we had the Paris Accord. Unfortunately, the United States withdrew, and the goal of the Paris Accord was modest compared to the risk of climate change. We need to be much more aggressive, and universities need to lead the way and be actual living laboratories on how we get to a healthy carbon future.
Can I bring this back to some of our British Vice Chancellors? With all these other pressures we've been speaking about, how can we create the political will for the scale of cooperation that is needed on some of these issues like climate change? Who wants to volunteer for that one? Professor Peter Matheson.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mukul. I mean, so both on that specific issue and on collaboration more generally, I do believe I agree with the questioner that these things need to be incentivized. And I think universities need to incentivize that within themselves and also between the different organizations and between the different nations. I think we're much better at recognizing research and rewarding it than we are some of the activities, including teaching, but also outreach and various other knowledge exchange and whatnot. We're not as good at incentivizing those. We're not as good at assessing excellence in those areas. And I think we need to get better if we're going to encourage the behaviors that we want to encourage. As regards collaboration between universities, we're all members of numerous university networks. The question for any network is always, what can it do which is greater than the sum of its parts? I do think there's another silver lining of COVID here in the sense that this collaboration that we've been forced to undertake using digital means has certainly for some of our relationships with some other parts of the world been a plus in some way. It's much easier to talk to somebody if you don't have to get on an aeroplane and spend hours getting there, and even allowing for time zone differences. So I think there are some definite silver linings to be identified there. I think international collaborations need to be changed in the light of the learning of coronavirus. Universities are very, very traditional organizations, and we need to do things in a more modern way, and we can learn from other international organizations, particularly around climate change, but also around some of the other agendas. So yeah, I think international cooperation is is vitally important. I think it's here to stay, but I think we may need to adapt our methodologies a bit.
So, I mean, I think probably time for one more comment on collaboration. I mean, from where I sit, you know, as public broadcasters too, we are trying to solve big problems and collaborate across borders. But if I may observe, at least in our area, it's great. We can meet up, we can talk, but to actually meaningfully, you know, go past our constitution, if you like, you know, how can that really be done? I mean, can we just hear briefly from Professor Tracy and let's start with Professor Byrne.
Look, I agree with everything that's been said. I just want to add one little example of my own that I've established with Michael Crowe from Arizona State and the University of New South Wales, an alliance called Plus Alliance. We've appointed hundreds of joint appointments all around SDGs. And the amount of energy around that is just enormous. That type of international collaboration works perfectly well with modern IT technology. And interestingly, two of the universities I've mentioned, King's and ASU, have both been top 10 both times that the first credible SDG alignment table of world universities has been done. I think this is just the beginning of massive collaborations of this type. We call them depth collaborations as opposed to the more project-specific ones.
Briefly, Professor Tracy.
Yeah, I mean, just, you know, there is such a growth. I mean, universities have always collaborated. I mean, that is, again, a fairly straightforward part of most scientific endeavour, you know, and other endeavours from other disciplines as well, the humanities and social sciences. Of course, in the UK, we have the UKRI, we have our funding councils, which are very much encouraging, and again, more and more you see from the funding agencies, and I'm sure it's the same in NIH funding, that there are requirements to be putting bids in that are very collaborative and cross-institutional and international because of the nature of what they've highlighted in the call and what they're going to do. And, you know, academics are quite pragmatic, you know, they'll follow the money, frankly, in order to make sure they can deliver on the work that they're going to do. So there's a responsibility too from our funding agencies to set the agenda. But I think if I understood what the question was also getting at, and Janet touched on this a little bit, was less about the collaboration that, again, we do and we could do better for sure, is more how would we work together to be a stronger voice, to actually take charge and, you know, proper delivery of the solution around some of these big global problems. And that's not just about understanding the answer and the science, that's actually affecting change. And that, I can't really think of many examples, I'd be interested if others can, where you could say, actually, we changed the political agenda or conversation because we came together as groups of universities and change the conversation, or we influence policy. It's small, we'll influence policy in terms of nice guidelines around a drug or something else, but in terms of actually really influencing policy, where can you point to us doing that? Something that we should be doing more. And I think that's probably where the question was also
No, that's really interesting. And thank you for throwing that back, because of course we're coming to the end of our time, but I think we can't let that go. We have to just ask if anybody can think of such an example, or maybe an area where that could become something that we move to. I don't know if anybody wants to quickly come in on that.
One of the things I've tried to promote in the alliances that I've been a member of in both in my current job and my previous job is this idea that a group of like-minded universities, preferably in lots of different countries, can influence policy if they're able to unify around certain issues. And one I would highlight is actually gender equity, where there has been some evidence, I think, of groups of universities being able to influence policy. And the example I'm thinking of is Japan. In Japanese universities, there are extremes of gender inequity, and the Japanese government now allows female-only appointments in subjects where there is a certain level of extremity of the gender mismatch. And I think that was in response, at least partly, to lobbying from international alliances, which include Japanese universities. So that's one I would just highlight, is I think individual universities sometimes can't influence policy. Groups of universities can, especially if they're international, because then governments will pay attention.
So I'm afraid we are coming right to, we've stretched the time a bit already. But what I'm going to do is, I mean, actually, you know, I was going to say, us journalists often get accused of focusing on the negative. But I think we're actually getting towards something quite interesting and positive in the discussion at the moment. So what I'm going to do is finish this off by asking each of you for just a very short sentence on a reason to be cheerful, actually, despite these huge challenges around the public good. Very short if you can. A reason to be cheerful now. And if I start perhaps with Peter Matheson.
Thanks, Mukul. I think there are lots of reasons to be cheerful. I think the biggest one for me is the transformative power of university education. I can think of so many examples of people who I've met and spoken to, either as part of universities I've been working in or some other interaction, whose lives have been transformed forever by their experience of education. It's not necessarily just universities, it can be secondary education as well. So I think the transformative power is still there, and boy, is it needed in many parts of the world. So I think that's a reason for me to be cheerful. We have very powerful tools at our disposal, and we have to deploy them effectively.
Great, thank you. And Professor Irene Tracy.
Yeah, similar thing. Obviously, I've been in it for 35 years, the best part of my whole career. So I still firmly believe, that education and again, from school through to university, it is the most powerful engine we've got to create opportunity, I know that there are still challenges around equality, but it's moving in the right direction there, and social change for the better. So that's fundamentally why I buy in, and that's why I stay in this job. I think it does play a pivotal role, as Peter said, and it can be, it's transformative in my own personal life, and I've seen that played out time and time again. And there's a sort of supply and demand. I mean, I'm an optimist, so I look at that data and I see a lot of positive things in the poll. I mean, people get it, and they see that, that we have value and we can add something. So whilst there's recognition of that and whilst there's demand, we will supply. Great,
and thank you for that. And Professor Edbert.
Let me take a smaller example than my colleagues, but it's pertinent. Can we raise a gear as a sector? Well, obviously we can. I mean, look at the amazing way the sector has risen to the COVID crisis. Not only moving thousands of staff and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of students online and educating them adequately and examining them adequately, but in the big research universities, masses of COVID research, designing ventilators, running drug trials, supporting hospitals. We've come to the needs so effectively as a sector, and all individual need for kudos is gone. Everybody's pulled in together. And, the fact that we've done it so magnificently shows that we can do it more often.
Great, thank you. And last word to you, President Napolitano.
Well, I agree there's a lot to be cheerful about, even in a period of great challenge. Universities have been around for more than 1,000 years. They'll be around for another 1,000 years, but they will evolve and are demonstrating that they're capable of that evolution in the current circumstances. They're amazingly resilient institutions.
Great. Well, look, all it remains for me is to say a huge thank you to all of our panelists. And thank you to everyone who has attended this. It's a shame we couldn't be together in person, but I'm glad that we have been able to be together in this way. So thank you very much. A recording of this webinar and the other webinars that the US-UK Fulbright Commission runs will be available on their YouTube channel, which is US-UK Fulbright. And you can, please do go to www.fulbright.org.uk to find out more information about the US-UK Fulbright program. And thank you very much for coming. Thanks for me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Mukul.
Thank you, Mukul. Bye.